preliminary round of the 2016 World Schools Debating Championship. Please turn off all your mobile phones. Thank you.
The phone.
No matter. Motion for this House criminal trials. Debating this round are Team South Korea, who are proposing, as well as Team India, who are opposing. Speaking for the proposition are first speaker, Gowan Kim, second speaker, Nicholas Kim, and third speaker, Shivan Moon. Please welcome them. Speaking for the opposition party. Second speaker, Hemant. And third speaker, Dhananjay. Judging this debate are Theodore from Greece, Judita from Czech Republic, and Laura from Germany. Speaking time for the speeches is 8 minutes. The first and objective from points counted after the 7th minute. There are no points of information during the reply speeches. It is now my pleasure to welcome Gowan Kim, the first speaker of the proposition, to open the debate.
Is everyone ready? Whatever else may be involved in the trial. We will also keep video archives so that people can refer back to evidence in the future. And it is possible, and we recognize that victims are aware of their privacy as well. In this case, according to the victim's will, we are also willing to hide their names, hide the place that they live in, and such personal information. Anything beyond that is directly relevant to the case is something that we are willing to release to the public fully. So let's move on into our first argument, why this actually empowers the public's right to be informed, and why, as a consequence, this improves justice in the criminal justice system. The problem that we identify today is that people are extremely distant from the legal system. There's no channel of access to the legal system because it happens in an isolated environment in a courtroom where no one else except the people who have the willingness to travel so far as to go and watch the courtroom have access to the events. In the event that a certain trial becomes viral and becomes so popular in the public, all we have are snippets of the trial. All we have are parts of the testimony, parts of the cross-examination that not the public, but the media thought were most important and were going to be more sensational. Consequently, Mr. Madam Speaker, judges lack scrutiny. The law lacks scrutiny because there is no one to be held accountable. And this is exactly the point at which bias feeds into the decisions that are made in the court. Number one, we think that the problem is that this often causes bias in the decisions that are being made in the legal system. We especially see that in the cases such as the United States, there are racial and sexual biases that are involved in almost every court case that we see. 75%, Mr. Madam Speaker, of blacks are convicted guilty of murder, whereas less than 30% of whites are convicted guilty, even when they were guilty in the first place. We think that all of these problems and statistics show that individuals who are the majority, individuals influence the legal system for long already have the system was to create fairness for all, was to allow everyone to be considered equally before the law. There is a fundamental breach in the status quo upon that principle. The biggest problem here is that judges don't care. Jurors don't care. Why? There is no way to hold them accountable. Judges simply don't have an incentive to be fair under the status quo because, in fact, their biases leak into the decisions they made. In fact, are most fair when they already that were traditionally considered in the status quo rather than the majority. We clearly see this in cases such as the Brock Turner case, in which Brock Turner's father wrote letters to the judge saying that our son did no fault, our son is the innocent one, but rather the media was also influenced this by as well. They only reported cases once the victim released a letter saying that I was the victim. Before that, there was absolutely nothing to confirm that the victim actually was a victim of that case. Even after all of the information was released, because of the significant media bias and because of the significant bias that was involved in the judge's decision to begin with, people were outraged by the decision because the sentencing was only 6 months and the convicted person deserved much more than that. We also believe that victims are significantly harmed as a consequence. Victims also have to rely on the media and only the media to convey their opinions. There is absolutely no other way to involve things like public discourse and objective opinions and diverse opinions within the legal system. Nick is going to further explain this in his third argument, but we further believe that victims are harmed because there is no one to tell their story, because absolutely everything they have to rely on always has some sort of bias fed into it. And we think that this causes all of the problems of bias that we see in the legal system. Before I move on, yes.
Do you support the principle of independent judiciary?
What do you mean by that? Can you clarify? All right, sure, let's move on. Why is the system going to be fundamentally changed? We think that judges, first of all, have an incentive because now they know, even without the public being involved in the courtroom, that they can be recalled, that the public is always watching them, that they're receiving the scrutiny of every single person out there who has access to cable TV. We think that once judges have that incentive, they know after the trial, if they made a terribly wrong decision, and a biased one in fact, they are going to get recalled. They're never going to get reelected into the courtroom. People are going to severely criticize them. Their reputation is going to be tarnished. All of these things make sure that the public can check and balance the legal system in a way that has never happened before. The reason why we think that that check and balance isn't going to go too far is that the public always has objective evidence to refer to. They know that there are video archives of the case. They know that if they go back and listen to the cross-examination, they're going to look at the convicted person admitting his mistake. They're going to look at the victim illustrating the case in a detailed manner. In these cases, there is so much information to the public's disposal. The public is going to be able to check and balance the legal system in a way that makes it most objective as possible. Having said that, let's move on to the second argument, that there is an improved trust in the fairness of the legal system, Mr. Madam Speaker. We do agree that there are sometimes, in many cases, that are exceptions to the first argument, that there are good cops, that there are good judges as well. But we think that this trust in the legal system is fundamentally diluted because of the corrupted cases, because the cops that kill innocent Black people are the only ones that receive attention, because they're the ones who are let off the hook, and that is everything that the public cares about. We think that the public lacks the ability to comprehend the situation statistically, situations that were terrible, that were unfair and biased. Example of Arizona, in which they removed habeas corpus for the cops, resulting in several unjust arrests. What this led to was not necessarily the public protesting against the government saying, institute habeas corpus again. Rather, they bribed it against the police. Rather, they said that this is an unfair system. I'm not going to follow any of the instructions that the cops tell me to follow. There are several problems. Number one, there's a lack of cooperation. Less people trust in and actually provide the information that is necessary to run the legal system in the first place. You have things like back backlash and riots. It feeds into the public sentiment that cops are not trustworthy. The legal system is not trustworthy because they always get off the hook because it is fundamentally biased. We think that this leads to the legal system being fundamentally even more biased because less people will be willing to provide information to begin with. Second of all, if you are a victim, you don't report that rape case, you don't report that murder case because you believe that as a woman fighting against a college guy with rich lawyers, you have no chance of winning that case because Brock Turner got away with 6 months. Because there are so many other cases that are highlighted by the media which emphasize that you're not going to be represented within the legal system. We think that it fundamentally improves under our case in which we televise all of these, all of the criminal trials that happen, because now everyone can be held accountable. There are objective facts and people actually speaking and providing testimonies that can actually support your case. There's overall improved fairness in the legal system, improved justice in whatever decisions the judges may make. For all of those reasons, we are proud to propose.
Thank you, Gowan, for your speech. But a short interruption. Would the judges mind giving their feedback in a train course of other appointments? Okay, thank you. So let's please welcome Kartik, the first speaker of the opposition.
Let's recognize that today's debate takes place in a context in which people hate criminals. People see criminals as others, as inhuman, as people who don't deserve rights. That's why they can make jokes like "don't drop the soap" and trivialize the suffering of 200,000 prisoners who get raped every year. That's why they treat them like animals and are okay with prison plantations treating them as literally bonded labor. The thing is, people don't care about people whom they perceive to be criminals. People assume guilt. People say that this is a criminal, they don't deserve rights. That's why their policy falls. I'll explain why. The thing is, we have to prove today that this policy compromises the fairness of justice, and second, that this perception of criminality is skewed on their side. It is to our independent, we can win if we prove either. They have to defend perpetuating harmful stereotypes of criminals and defending and attacking the principle of innocent until proven guilty. Here's the thing, a few points of rebuttal. Particularly on their model, the rest will be integrated into my substantive. On their model, they basically said we'll publicize all trials and put them on all channels. This ignores an incredible logistical problem. There are hundreds and thousands of trials each year. You can't possibly broadcast. You need some clarity on your side also. Which case in particularly will broadcast? Will it be serious crimes, white-collar crimes? We haven't heard any clear criteria as to when it's okay to broadcast, when it's not. We also need to know what exactly you're going to cover. Are you going to cover every single thing? Because there's so much. Trials take years to cover. If you have a case being dragged out over years, it's unlikely there's going to be any impact. We need to hear anything on that side. The significance of this is that if their policy is logistically impossible to implement with any benefits whatsoever, that is, if they want to cover it fully, it takes too long to use, it takes too long, and people just don't care. They don't get any of the benefits they wanted to talk about. Well, if the media maybe cut out or the more juicy bits or more controversial bits takes place, that's why the media can misrepresent the situation. That's where this debate takes place. That's the kind of thing we need to say that the model acknowledges. I'll address the rest of the support responsible reporting by the media, including we don't supporting name changes. We support name changes in reporting. We support post-conviction coverage of the issue and analysis on what it means for the criminal justice system as a whole. We support discussion on whether it should be reformed or not. We think that happens much better on our side because it's much more not opinionated, it's much more objective. What is our principle? We think this threatens the judicial process through three main ways, three core principles that are violated. But first, yes.
How can we even have objective discussion in the first place when people even do not know about what happened in the trial?
People find out. Like the thing is, often many people treat criminals as animals, and those people will not be part of the discussion anyway. Often people don't care. Those people will not be part of the discussion anyway. Who we are talking about in this debate are people who are on the fence, people who can be influenced, people who do have the capacity to care, people who may want to get involved. That's the kind of people you can address with that POI. That's the kind of people we just address where you will hurt on your thing that criminals are worse when you put them on TV and you show attorneys saying, what have you done? What is your criminal record? That's the kind of perception you get with trials. Three ways: the rights of victims, because it hurts the presumption of innocence in criminal trials, and third, because it threatens judicial independence. How does it hurt the rights of victims? When victims have their lives put on TV and are asked invasive questions about their background for the purpose of a story, for the purpose of media coverage, to get TRPs in a 24/7 news cycle that requires their life stories to be devoured, for there to be any entertainment, for there to be any viewership of this criminal trial. That's a crime perpetrated with this kind of aggressive questioning, invasive questioning by attorneys. They have to deal with the rest of the world, seeing them as victims. That's something we don't tolerate. That's why we think rights of victims are hurt more on their side than on ours. Second, on the presumption of innocence. When you have public perception of crime being skewed in because of the fact people really presume guilt, people see criminals as on trial in what people think. We think it's a fundamental principle of the criminal justice system that we can't convict people just because we think they're wrong, just because we think that what they've done is bad, to influence the justice process in this policy falls. The second argument is skewing perception of crime. Because in a world where criminals are hated, this skews the way we understand crime and what we can do about the criminal justice system. If their policy significantly think about criminals and degrade the way they think about criminals, it's much more likely that they can't get the kind of reform justice system, like the fact prison reform, like the way we treat minorities in prison. That's the kind of thing that needs to be reformed, that can't happen on their side when nobody wants to help criminals because they think that they're inhumane and they don't want to do anything about them. So how is this true? First, because of sensationalism. The media needs to get the kind of profits it can get from this story. That means they will cut and paste most juicy and controversial bits into the story, like cross-questioning the victim, and not actually represent the entire case. They see the issue of crime as reality TV, therefore, because people will now think of it as keeping up with crime and the Kardashians. We think it's not really controversial. They'll trivialize the process until it becomes something that is not really worth reform. It's not really worth caring about these criminals in the first place. Second, on racism, because that's a fact. Minorities are worst affected by the criminal justice system. These are the people who we will find much more often on TV in that defendant seat. If people keep seeing black people on TV, they're much more likely to think these people are much more criminal than others. We think they should be punished more. That's why they support racist things like mandatory minimums. And third, rehabilitation. This is important because if you're a criminal and you want to be rehabilitated, you depend on society accepting you. In a world where your employer sees people on TV being tried and says, I'm not going to give you a job because criminals are bad, and I think that you are a criminal, shouldn't be rehabilitated, I think you should be punished more. In a world where your family and friends don't accept you because of the widespread hatred that they cause towards criminals, we think that's harmful. Because of the fact that public perception of crime is skewed by their policy, because it threatens the judicial process, we're so proud to oppose.
Thank you, Kartik, for your speech. I'd now like to call Nicholas Kim to give his speech. Judges ready?
Team India today is entitled to the notebooks they write on. Team India today is entitled to the table upon which they write on. Team India today is entitled to their own opinions, but Team India is not entitled to their own facts. Unfortunately, the problem that Team India face today is they refuse to engage with the reality that is this world. They refuse to engage Colin gave you. They only engage the case. They prepare for the world in which judiciary isn't response.
How does an American on trial affect the public perception?
Firstly, we don't think you always see African Americans on trial. I'll give you 3 examples. You see Jodi Arias, you see Casey Anthony, you see a lot of individuals already within the status quo that aren't black. That was an absolute assertion on your side. You can't just talk about a world that doesn't exist. Secondly, we like to point out that oftentimes separation breeds bigotry. That in the status quo, when you don't see black people on TV, or you don't see white individuals on TV as criminals as well, you already do assume this. So when you see on trial and on TV that they aren't black individuals, is somehow so much more inherently different from actually showing that video. 2 points of contention. Firstly, on the AVB clear nuanced characterization policy, we told you why we're going to have video archives so individual public people can access it. Well, they said, oh no, you can't possibly put every single case on trial, which is exactly a straw man, televise every single trial. Archives as well. You have video debate archives. I mean, Team India is live streaming this debate right now, Madam Speaker. The fact is, in many instances, what you do have is you have that and you store away so individuals can see the trials and hold the judiciary accountable. But we also no engagement to our entire first argument. We told you that oftentimes judging that they don't have accountability. We told you that there are racial and sexual biases that don't exist and cannot exist, and yet they still exist because there's no clear accountability mechanism within the structural barrier. No response on their side. We show you that there is a clear incentive to be fair, to show and clearly explain why your decision was fair. No response on their side. We've clearly shown you why, in fact, in many cases, the public does have the right to know. Because I, as a citizen of South Korea, want to know if the judge from South Korea will sentence me properly. If not, I want to fix it, and I deserve to be able to fix it because my taxpayer money goes directly into the pockets of that judge. But what did we tell you? What did we heard from their side? The invasion of privacy. We already told you in our policy that if in fact the victim doesn't want to be seen, we're going to do that. But oftentimes the victim, we told in the first, other victims as well. That's why you see O.J. Simpson's family or the families of murder victims saying, I decided to press charges even though it would bring financial ruin upon me, because I don't want those other individuals to suffer because I suffered as well. That's a harm you ignored. They told you then questioning is invasive. Seriously. Questioning is invasive on both worlds. What all night. Because you're on TV or you're on that that come out that we naturally hate individuals in the first place. Firstly, we'd like to point out, if you see a lot of people on TV that are criminals, you'd begin to realize that not all criminals are the kind of stereotypical bad people in the alleyway you talked about in the first place. Like, maybe John Edwards could be put in prison for white-collar crimes as well. Maybe he's just as bad for society. Maybe a football player can come in, though I see him on Fight Hero all the time. Cases the media supports the criminals. Here's the main contradiction, because on one side they inherently hate criminals. The sentence they gave you was that the media will favor these criminals. Which one is it? It shows a clear principled misunderstanding. We need to hear a response. Now that I've gone over the 2 points of contention, let's go on to the third. By televising trials, criminal justice system is given millions I press charges because I don't want the person down the street to also be harmed by that. We also told you how that oftentimes these individuals that are victims can see that and go actually to the legal system, because you realize the person on TV got the same thing for 50 years. maybe I should as well. It's illegitimate, so long as we agree it is legitimate. Money is only legitimate and has value only insofar as we agree that it has value. In that way, Madam Speaker, we've shown you a moral, consistent, clear case we are so proud to pose.
Thank you, Nicholas, for his speech. It is now my pleasure to ask Hemant to give his speech.
Panel, in their first speech, side proposition starts this debate by saying that black people are on trial, and therefore now you apparently empathize with these black people and understand that they are unfair victims of the criminal justice system. Then, quite amazingly, in the second speech, this narrative becomes, no, you don't see them. As a result of also seeing white people on trial, you think black people don't commit crimes. Not only is this on its fact and by definition an absolute contradiction, it is quite a disingenuous way of looking at society and quite dangerous to look at it this way. Why so? Because African Americans are definitely harmed by the criminal justice system. That is to say that definitely a large number of these trials will be African Americans on this stand. Why? Because drug laws that disproportionately affect them, racial profiling, mandatory minimums, and so on. Therefore, the comparative we brought to you was that when you constantly see an African American being on trial, the perception that African Americans are criminals is entrenched. You buy that. What was now a random stereotype, a random joke that a friend cracked, is now statistical for you. The first speaker tells you that we need to look at things statistically, exactly what happens on their side of the house. But every time you switch on the TV and go on to this random channel which telecasts this, you see a black person on trial, given the fact that the criminal justice system disproportionately targets black people. But if they tell you that apparently all people are leftist liberals who are likely to have an excellent intellectual critique of the criminal justice system, and the moment they see a black person on TV, they're going to think, oh no, that person is being disproportionately affected, that is just a lie. What is the second biggest contradiction they made in their second speech? So the first speech they told you all trials will be telecasted. When he pointed to you the multiple problems, they're not just logistically, but about specific cases being sensitive, they took a step back and narrowed the debate into some pertinent trials. This pertinence of trials also is out hanging in the debate, and they've never actually shown us what trials will actually be telecast. What was our principle in this debate? This debate is most importantly, like we set up in our first speech, about judicial fairness. What did we tell you? One, victims. The victims have already lost their dignity, and it's a double jeopardy for them to be telecasted with prosecutors and defendants going on and on, asking them invasive questions, asking them to testify by repeating it's quite traumatizing that happened. By telecasting, this is not only violating the dignity, they would have depends on public pressure creating particular judicial outcomes, even if it can be in one or two cases utilitarian. Why? Because judicial fairness depends on independence, on its ability, what kinds of sentences should be given to public, and it depends on its ability to check the public. Entire case is a violation of the most basic and core legal principles. De facto, we won this debate. But what is the other argument we further to? We're talking about African American people. I've already sufficiently talked to you about this. But the second thing we talked to you about was things like rehabilitation, things like prison, things like the detestable conditions of prisons and need to change and create political capital for them. And Karthik elegantly explained to you how when always on TV there's a prosecutor demonizing these criminals, when you only get to see, like the second speaker tells you, the most horrible of crimes, you will never be able to achieve sustainable change in prison systems. But secondly, criminals will never be able to rehabilitate into society when societal perception of criminals is always one of demonization. We also win on outcomes. But let's look at some attacks on their moral. First, we ask you about witness protection. There was no clarity. Domestic abuse and rape, they tell you that as a rape victim, it is now necessary for you, for your story to be heard at all, or believed at all, to telecast your sufferings and your trauma and to the entire world, and have your trauma supplemented with a societal taboo that comes with being a rape victim. Sir. How do you telecast this? If it's a full story that actually lasts contradiction of the entire first speech, they lose it. So what is their best case right now? They go with their initial principle and be consistent and tell you that they. What does that mean? Nobody cares, but the violation of principle media still exists. So we still win that debate. Finally, it is also logistically impossible for their case to be reality. I'll take you.
How is, under your case, the judiciary not swayed by the public when in fact we still have you still have media reports that demonize criminals and say that they're bad people?
Already, things like changing names. And that's the condition that wins us this debate. So moving on, what is the most important example they further give? Brock Turner. And this was quite a joke because it was completely unorthodox. At the point at which the CNN spent 5 days after the Brock Turner case telecasting how this athlete's life was now going to be ruined, this Olympic swimmer who would have won more gold medals than Michael Phelps was now going to go to jail and therefore lose his ability to compete in the Olympics. We think it is counterproductive for this to happen on their side. Even in their best example, we win this debate. Finally, the last thing I had to tell you, the last concession, the death blow they gave to their own speech in their second speech was when they conceded when they gave you an example where the juries were not allowed to look at the TV. What this meant was that the can indeed sway you and therefore consider our case. Moving on, what is my constructive? Their case becomes being hard on crime. How does this happen? Because like the second speaker tells you, people are ill-placed to judge crime. Therefore, they don't know about technical things like evidence being admissible or not. Therefore, when they see manipulation by prosecutors, they begin to hate crime. Not only does this push rehabilitation, no, it has 3 effects. There is a widespread public on crime. One, when people vote for prosecutors or judges, they vote for people who call themselves as tough on crime and provide disproportionate penalties. Second, there is public pressure to create sentences that might not be proportional to the crime. And that's the kind of we have to consider. Thirdly, and most importantly, people political point of view on rights, or like they say they're going to fix crime, and that's the kind of pressure that exists that ruins the criminal justice system. Now the incentive means that the basic principle of being proportional on crime is lost. We abhor that. We absolutely win this debate.
Thank you, Hemant, for your speech. Please welcome Shiva Moon, the third speaker of the session.
The reason why opposition ultimately already loses today's debate is that ultimately the arguments that they bring in today's debate becomes even worse under their side. They talk about things like sensationalization, yet what they are supporting, ladies and gentlemen, is not televising the full trial. We think that there will be more sensationalization, as our arguments have already told you. We think that under their world, it will become more and more like clickbait, and we think that fundamentally contradicts everything they presented in their arguments. Before I move on to my clashes, clarification, because the DLO criticizes contradictions. The first speaker of our side are on trial, and second speaker said that they also see white people. We really think that they need to listening to our case, right? Because what we are telling you is that it's not only black people that necessarily disproportionately and statistically receive more trials, but what we see is that currently in society there is much more focus on these black people. Why? Because they selectively decide to show such reports. Why is this better under our case? Because we think that the media now televises all trials. We think that it's not that it's disproportional. We think that there will be equal televisation of people, Hispanic people, black people. We think that it makes it much more objective under our side, right? And then they also came up and criticized us. Get these criminals single-handedly characterize these people and people. We think that now they actually have the full information, as I'll later talk about. All of them. We already gave you adequate response, Madam and Mr. Speakers. We told you, but firstly, how this is only a practical point, and we clearly distinguish it by giving you the full video archives, right? And they need to listen into this. But then if they're not even dissatisfied with that, we think if that is such a problem, that practicality point is such a problem, we think that we can actually base it on things like popularity. So obviously, if more individuals are inclined to watch a certain televised trial, we all that will be in terms of televisation. We do not think that is a we told you that's the mere extension of what you're the mere superficial, on the surface discussion that happens without examination, without actually happening the full details of the trial. They simply say, oh, because George Zimmerman was a Hispanic man who shot a black man, that must have been a racist crime. We think that these type of sensational actions and beliefs are eradicated under our side because we do not support things like sensationalization while they do. Therefore, we tell you that under this first clash, we clearly win. Why? Because not only have we provided you a justification, but we better correct the societal problem we see by eradicating things like sensationalization. But second clash, let's also break this down into the various stakeholders that we see in today's debate. Firstly, let's talk about victims. The two primary things we heard coming from their side was firstly about how we need to start requiring life stories to be heard, to be devoured, right? And you have things like invasive questioning. Firstly, we would like to point out that this invasive questioning still exists under their side. So double jeopardy, we really do not think how that is the case when under both models, you still have judges, you still have cross-examiners asking invasive questions. But secondly, we actually told you that certain victims want their stories to be heard, a point that we never heard an engagement from. We even give you an example of O.J. Simpson about how victims suffer, and I do not want my fellow ethnicity or fellow race people suffering the same crime as I did. Then I want my story to be heard. And that was a point that they failed to understand, right? Because not all victims simply blanket-handedly and one characterization of them not wanting their stories to be heard. And we need an engagement on that point. But last but not least, if this privacy were to be such a problem, we already distinguished in our model that we are going to respect to the victim. We are going to distinguish things like exposing names, exposing where you live, or whatnot. So you need to start actually engaging with our case. But what we told you that we better our side, because we start firstly exposing the stories, and you start getting the message out what this victim actually suffered. But how is this achieved? Secondly, because we fix the paradigm under our side. You start having things like features, right? So we think that right now what happens is that these families of the victims do not even go to these trials because they think, oh, even though I go to the trial, it's like this white criminal will still escape the law. It's not like anything is going to change, right? But because now under our policy, we have active televisation and active accountability, we actually see that these poor families, the victims' families will be more inclined to go and actually get the victims featured. Now let's also briefly talk about criminals. When they talk about things like presumption of innocence, that is ridiculous because we are not saying in today's debate that we support things like guilty before innocent. And we think that just because you televise it doesn't automatically presume that you're innocent. We do not understand why that argument stands. But bigger than this, the biggest point coming from their side was stigmatization. We told you that firstly, there's this pity from the public, right? If you have nationwide attention in that trial, then once you're revealed as innocent, and once the criminal is absolved of his blame, we think that the public will also acknowledge that. Just like when they thought beforehand they were guilty, we do not think that the stigmatization will exist. But even if that were not the case, we think that secondly, there will be more stigmatization under your side. Because what happens in the Your model is that George Zimmerman, without actually even people knowing about the full details of the trial, is stigmatized, is looked upon because he was Hispanic. Under our side, people can make the right judgment, which is why we tell you that this, last but not least, about trust. We told you about things like habeas corpus. What did we hear from their side? Absolutely nothing, which is why we think that in terms of shifting the societal narrative, it will also be better under our side. At the end of the day, we're not taking away the judiciary's job, but we think that actually judiciary is locked up in hotel rooms. But what we provide is a better understanding from the public.
Thank you, Jivan, for the speech. I'd now like to call Dana Che to give a speech.
Because darker, but it will actually go back to the light.
The first point of information in this debate, they didn't understand our question on whether or not they supported an independent judiciary. And by the end of the debate, it was apparent that they didn't independent judiciary. It's a judiciary that is free from outside coercions. It is free from the whims of the people who we cannot trust to be objectively good all the time. It is free from things like the government who is likely to coerce them. That is the reason we have the law and we have the judiciary to have its own doctrine, to have its own systems in check and free from outside coercion. That is the reason why judiciaries are always the most independent bodies in all governments around the world. We treasure independent judiciaries. We believe any reform in that process has to happen within those judiciaries. It's extremely important and extremely possible to do it without bringing in other biased actors. And they've failed to acknowledge the fact that independent judiciaries are important for true justice. What are the three questions in Firstly, comparison on each side supported the right to information. Our distance from right to information, and they need to know. That is not true. They never once proved to us why these people really need to know about exactly what happens in these crimes, in these trials. These trials don't really affect them in their personal lives. At very best, they gave us a small one-liner on how whether or not the judicial system is working affects these people. Firstly, people get an idea of whether or not the judicial system is working. There are several critical systems in place in America, regardless of these televised things. At that point, their policy is redundant when they infringe on the rights of victims for absolutely no purpose, no overarching purpose whatsoever. The right to know is invalidated here when we more important right we have been giving you from the beginning of the debate, the right to dignity and of these victims. What have we told? The main thing they've already undergone. They have suffered, and we do not want to put them way, they implied that they were going to give snippets to the people because they acknowledge that the long version is just redundant, after which the trial stage technical. They are boring, people are unlikely to look at them. Therefore, they slip the case in the second speech. Then when our second speaker came out, extremely perception of people, which is where we get to the trials by media. Yes.
Under your model, how do you make sure that a racist and sexist judge never enters the courtroom again?
Thank you. We'll get to that under how judicial reform is a better thing on our side of the house. But before that, okay, we're talking about a trial by media. Now, in a trial by media, their idea wasn't even objecting it. They actually supported that. They supported that the public system due to this as the proper check on that on this judicial system, and the fact that they came up here and evaded the POI on voting in elected judges is representative. They realize that that's a mess. Because they actually mean the answer no is what answer or no. They gave us a very shady answer, and yes is essentially what they're going with on their side. Let's look at the places where elected judges do exist and look at the outcomes. Judges are more hard on crime. Judges are more racially abusive. and judges are basically extremely bad on their side of the house, because accountability to the people is not necessarily a good thing when the people are crazed against criminals. When the people see sensational news where criminals are already and always as inherently a good thing, they assumed it. And whereas on the house, the status quo better status quo on the points we told you about reforms in the judicial
and third, on the independent judiciary. What did we hear from them on their side. But if they do report it, if that rape victim does have to see her testimony on someone shared it, what happens? We think that tragedy that's important than anything being born.